Hello there. As you all know, we are building up to a huge event this July. We're getting a brand spanking new Superman movie. We don't know if it's going to be any good, if it's going to make any money, but at this point, most fans are very, very excited about this movie. So I thought it would be fun today to rank the previous Superman movies from worst to best. So let's go. Let's get on with it and let's do it. You know, the first movie I ever saw was Superman 78, and we'll get to that movie later on and we'll give it a little bit of a discussion. Where would it be? Is it predictable? Is it unpredictable where it will be? Stay here to find out. So, look, I don't hate any Superman movie, but I had to, you know, I'm doing a worst to best, not a best to worst, a worst to best. So the best will be on the top of the tree. So the worst Superman movie, sadly, is Superman 4, The Quest for Peace. But in my opinion, it's not necessarily for the reasons everybody else cites it to be bad. There's a lot of good in that film. There's the double date. There's Superman's address to the UN. There's Nuclear Man's footprints, which at the time was some amazing VFX in a movie that didn't have very much good VFX. That still floors me from up to today when I still watch the movie. I actually like and enjoy watching Superman 4, The Quest for Peace. I don't believe the problem is the fact that they took away the budget of the movie and it looks so bad and it's barely 90 minutes long. And you can see they cut the hell out of the movie. There's a Fury cut. A lot of us want to see the Fury cut. But they're not my issues with the movie. They're everybody else's issues. You're doing a story about Superman, you know, tackling nuclear disarmament. It's a hot topic to deal with back in 87 because the threat of nuclear annihilation was a reality back in 1987. So it was a very controversial subject to tackle. When Christopher Reeve spoke to Superman 78 screenwriter Tom Mankiewicz, Tom warned Chris away from this subject matter, saying, this is the thing with superheroes. You mustn't allow them to tackle real-world issues. You mustn't allow them to solve real-world issues. During the Second World War, comic book writers at DC steered clear of involving Superman in the war. You know, he would deal body blows to, you know, Hirohito and Hitler, you know, helping where he could, but he never actually got involved in the action. There was not proper war stories in the comics for Superman. That was a great move. But I'm not totally against the nuclear disarmament story for Superman 4, The Quest for Peace. My problem with the film, and I didn't have this problem at a time as a 14-year-old boy watching the movie, as a 14-year-old boy, 14-year-old me loved this movie. 14-year-old me, he kind of knew it wasn't as long as it didn't have the quality of the other movies, but it wasn't that blatant to me. The lack of quality, that wasn't that blatant. I saw Superman fighting this superpowered dude, Nuclear Man. I enjoyed it. But looking at it now, the problem is the execution. They could have written a really compelling movie about nuclear disarmament. Because the moral of the film is that Superman can't heal the world of nuclear weapons and nuclear annihilation or the threat of it. And he says that in his speech to the world near the end of the movie. But it's not tackled well. It's, you know, you think, wow, and, you know, the film's actually a nonsense. It's not executed in the right way. You can't have Superman shoving nuclear missiles in a net and tossing them in the sun. It was insane. It wasn't tackled properly. I like the fact that a young boy writes a letter to Superman begging him to get rid of nuclear missiles. I like that. That was a great, that was a great way to begin the movie, to tackle this, this hot fudge of a subject. And then Superman turns the kid down. I think there is a scene where he actually does turn the kid down, but they cut it out of the movie, which of course was very, very dumb. They were trying to get as many viewings as possible. Exactly what they tried to do with Justice League as well. And ultimately, it didn't work. And it never worked with Superman 4, The Quest for Peace either. But there would have been a way to tackle this subject so well if you wrote it in a compelling, serious way. If you sacrificed more of the comedic element of the story and stuck to a story where Superman, basically as Lex Luthor says, is getting involved with the nuclear arms race. I think you needed a more serious Lex Luthor than Gene Hackman, or the way Hackman played him in Superman 78 and Superman 80, Superman the movie and Superman 2. They could have got Hackman to play the character differently and more serious in this movie if they wanted to stick with the same Lex Luthor. But considering they stuck with Christopher Reeve, they'd have to stick with Gene Hackman. Or would they? I don't know. You've got Lenny, Lex Luthor's nephew. They didn't have to have a Lex Luthor in this movie. You could have replaced him with the nephew, but instead of it being a jokey nephew, it could have been a kind of Michael Rosenbaum type of character. And he's getting involved with nuclear missiles, and it can be serious and it can be compelling. It could have been a very, very interesting story, and it simply wasn't tackled in the right way. So I don't think Chris made a mistake in wanting to tackle this subject. It was the writing. It was the storytelling. There are some great things in this movie. There are great things they cut out of the movie, but in the parameters that they wrote the movie in, they could have done something extremely special. They brought in Lacey Warfield. They wanted a younger model than Margot Kidder. That was Christopher Reeve's idea. Margot Kidder, who played Lois Lane, was not happy with Chris about that. I think what this film shows is maybe it was the right time for either to have Christopher Reeve maybe do a Kingdom Come story as he was becoming older, and take Superman, as Chris was getting older, to a new interesting direction with Kingdom Come. They could have done that. But once you sell the rights to Canon, you've got a problem. Because Canon didn't have the ambition to make a movie like that. And neither did the Salkinds at that point. Because Warners weren't interested in making their own Superman movie. So they were just interested in distributing Superman movies. And there lies the problem. And that's why Superman 4: The Quest for Peace was ultimately a bad, disappointing movie in my eyes. Now, on my next Superman movie on my worst to best list is, of course, Superman 3. I don't hate this movie. In fact, I really enjoy watching this movie. I think this is different to Superman 4: The Quest for Peace. I don't think Superman 3 is actually a bad movie. It goes along with the same kind of jokey, light tone, but there is also some very serious moments, more serious. Maybe there's elements of this film that are actually a lot darker than the other Christopher Reeve Superman movies. For example, when Superman turns bad because of the kryptonite and he becomes Clark Kent and Superman and they're fighting, you see how dark Christopher Reeve takes Superman. People say Cavill's Superman's dark. No. This was dark. And I think it was too dark for kids. I think it went too far in a lot of ways. But it was brilliant. That fight was outstanding. And as someone who went to film school, to see how they had, both, one actor playing two different characters on screen, and of course they flip it. Do we ever see them together? I think we do see them on the screen together, but it was done really, really well. Normally that kind of thing looks really, really fake, but it's clear that Richard Lester did a great job. Richard Lester was a great director. People hate Richard Lester because he replaced Dick Donner, but Richard Lester was a really, really talented, well-crafted director. So that's a great element. You see, originally, Ilya Salkind had another idea. He wanted to be more faithful to the comics. He wanted to have a Mxyzptlk. He wanted to have Supergirl. He wanted Brainiac. It was very, very ambitious. Sadly, Ilya wanted Superman and Supergirl to have a romance. Yes, that's actually true. And ultimately, Warner's didn't like the treatment. The treatment may have been bad, but the idea to have Mxyzptlk, Brainiac and Supergirl and Superman in the same movie was a good idea by Ilya Salkind and would have been brilliant, but you need the right writers, you need the right director. I don't necessarily think Richard Lester would have been right for that. I don't think the writers who wrote Superman 3 would have been right for that either. And I think that's the issue with that. But ultimately, I was never disappointed in Superman 3. I thought Robert Vaughn was a great Lex Luthor substitute. Ross Webster was a kind of Lex Luthor type of character. A lot of people don't like Richard Pryor. There's actually a gag in Richard Donner's Scrooged movie when Bill Murray throws some cold water over this waiter's face because he thinks he's burning alive, and he goes, "Sorry, I thought you were Richard Pryor." I don't think Dick Donner liked Richard Pryor being in Superman 3. Again, to remind you, Richard Donner had nothing to do with Superman 3. But I thought Richard Pryor did a great job. I thought Gus Skolman was hilarious. He was this loser who kind of gets sucked in and manipulated by Ross Webster. And I like that idea. And I like how Superman and Gus Skolman become friends. It's like computers were beginning to be a thing in 1983 when that movie came out. So it's basically technology versus human beings, and how technology can bite us on the backside, and it's biting us on the backside right now. So that was a very apt story. So even though Superman 3 is high up on my worst to best Superman movie list, I still enjoyed it. And I still think it's a solid movie. That moment when he freezes the lake and he carries it over to the fire, I think it's fantastic. When the green and the red lighted men, who's the pedestrian lighted men, come alive and start fighting, I think it's hilarious. And I think there's a lot of good. I love it when Superman kicks the missiles onto each other. I think that's really, really cool. And the Superman game that Ross Webster's playing, awesome. I'd love to play that game. I don't think they ever made it into a game, but that would have been really, really cool. So next on my Superman movie ranking from worst to best, where are we going to go after Superman 3? I think we have to go with Superman Returns. I've always been consistent in saying this, that Superman Returns is not a good movie. It's a movie with great moments rather than being a great movie. I think the costume is ludicrous. I think the costume defies logic. It makes Brandon Routh, who's around 6 foot tall and worked out to look great. It shrinks his body mass. It shrinks his height, and it makes him, he just looks like a weed. He doesn't look like Superman because of that costume. Why they thought that costume was a good idea. And if you notice in the film, there's a bit of a hole, not a plot hole. I suppose you can call it a plot hole if you want. When Clark goes back to the Daily Planet and he sees a newspaper article, Why the World Doesn't Need Superman by Lois Lane, it's a picture of Brandon Routh in his new Superman costume. Now, Superman had been away for 5 years looking for the remains of Krypton, right? So that costume is supposed to be, Superman never wore that costume before he left to look for Krypton. Or maybe he did. Maybe there was a time where he actually looked for that costume. It's always been my understanding that that costume Brandon Routh is wearing, he never wore it before he left to look for Krypton. Because the whole idea is after Superman 2, Superman goes looking for the remains of Krypton. And even Perry White goes in the briefing, he goes, is that a new costume? Because he's giving all these article ideas to all the different people and he's going, fashion, is that a new costume? He's wearing a new costume in an article before he leaves looking for Krypton. That would have been a great opportunity to show a picture in the article of Christopher Reeve in the original costume. Because it's a continuation anyway. And it doesn't really matter that Brandon Routh's now playing Superman. You could have just had a picture of Christopher Reeve in the old costume. That was pretty dumb. The dumbest thing was to cut the Return to Krypton sequence out of the film. The synopsis basically is from the depths of the ocean to the far reaches of outer space. Well, if you cut the Return to Krypton sequence out, there's no far reaches of outer space. It was a dumb idea. The whole point of the movie is that Superman's gone away for 5 years. Lois Lane is angry for him leaving without saying goodbye. She's now with Richard White. She's got a kid. But unfortunately, the film was maligned by fans. People called Superman a stalker. I thought that was nonsense. He literally is watching Lois, right, in her apartment with Richard White and his kid for about not even 2 minutes. And that's the only time he's watching her, by the way. So a stalker basically follows you everywhere you freaking go. And then they called him a deadbeat dad. That was another criticism of the movie. You can only be a deadbeat dad, boys and girls, if you actually know you're a dad. That was another dumb criticism of the movie. So the premise was interesting, but there was also inconsistencies within the VFX. It just seemed unfinished in places, but great in other places. Obviously, the aeroplane save is an outstanding piece of VFX. I thought the score was fantastic. But ultimately, Superman Returns does have a lot of inconsistencies. There were lots of opportunities to make that a great film, but ultimately you can't make a 2006 movie with the pacing of a 1978 movie. Bryan Singer was far too obsessed with Superman 78, and he couldn't make his mind up. Was this a continuation, or was this something new? He was trying to do a little of both, and ultimately it didn't work out. Perfecting Superman and making a great Superman movie that everybody loves is very difficult today. Why? Because everyone either wants something totally brand new, like Snyder did, or nostalgia, or a bit of nostalgia and something new. You can't really win with Superman fans, sadly. And ultimately, Superman Returns didn't have the consistency to become a beloved movie. It is beloved by many, many people. And there's certainly many, many moments from that movie that I appreciate, but it just didn't have the skeleton of a consistent Superman movie. So, we've done Superman 4, The Quest for Peace, just so I can remind myself, because it's not scripted, I haven't got this written down, it's off the cuff, but I know what I want in my list and where I want it. So Superman 4, The Quest for Peace, I've deemed the worst Superman movie, even though I love watching it. Then Superman 3, then Superman Returns. So next I think we have to say Batman vs Superman, Dawn of Justice. I like this film. I really do. I think it's an outstanding film, but the film shouldn't really exist, if I'm being honest. All we really wanted, and I said this the other day, we didn't need a DCEU. We needed Nolan and Goyer and Snyder to give us a Man of Steel trilogy like Nolan and Goya gave us a Dark Knight trilogy. And again, as I said the other day, if there was an energy from the creatives, the studio, and the fans for them to adapt another character and do another trilogy about another DC character, then fine. Then you could have the building blocks of a DCEU with these trilogies. That's where the mistake was. Batman vs Superman should never have been the sequel to Man of Steel. A proper Man of Steel 2 should have been made, and then it should have been Man of Steel 3. That's what should have happened. But Batman vs Superman is a deconstruction of both Batman and Superman. A lot of people say it's more of a Batman film than a Superman film. I wholeheartedly disagree. It's as much about Batman as it is about Superman. That's why both their names are in the title. But it's about them ultimately disliking each other at first, but then becoming friends by the end of the movie. The movie is trying to do something very real world, something very contemporary, as Man of Steel attempted to do itself. It has some fantastic moments. It has some world building. It's very interesting. It's trying to build up the DCEU. But they only threw Batman in a Man of Steel sequel because Man of Steel made 650, which the studio deemed as not enough. Chuck Batman in there, should make around $1 billion. Nearly, but not quite. It had a huge opening, but ultimately this film was one of the most divisive movies ever released in cinematic history. You have Batman killing. You have a very upset, depressed Superman throughout the whole movie. I think Superman does smile in Man of Steel. I think in Man of Steel, he feels more like the Superman we know and love than in Batman vs Superman. He seems quite miserable from the beginning of the movie, and that's the whole tone of the movie. And I can understand why a lot of people, a lot of Superman fans, didn't like that. As I say, I went to see the movie in the cinema very early, before it was even released. I loved it. I felt energized. I thought I'd just seen another Dark Knight quality movie. But that's not how critics and a lot of fans felt, and it did divide audiences. But I don't think Batman vs Superman Dawn of Justice is a bad movie. I just feel probably it's a movie that shouldn't exist. I'm glad it exists. I love it, but I think in terms for the character of Superman, it probably shouldn't exist, in my opinion. So yes, Batman vs Superman Dawn of Justice is next on my list. So then you've got to be looking at Superman 2. Yes, Superman 2 is in my top 3 in my worst to best Superman movies. So it's up there with one of my favourite movies. Look, a lot of people are going to say to you, there's only 2 Superman movies, Superman 78 and Superman 2, the Donner Cut. The thing is, this is the theatrical cut of Superman 2. I haven't put the Donner Cut in this list for one reason. Because the Donner Cut still has to use a test shot with Lois and Clark, Christopher Reeve and Margot Kidder in. It still has to use plenty of Richard Lester's scenes as well. And you see the kind of idea that Dick had for this movie and Tom Mankiewicz, but ultimately, this really isn't totally Dick Donner's creative vision. It is in a way. He was sitting there as they put this film together. I get that. And as much as I love Dick Donner's version, I've got to be fair and say that Richard Lester's Superman 2 was the movie I saw as a kid. It's a movie I fell in love with. And even though I appreciate the Donner Cut, it's not a completed Richard Donner movie, so I don't want to judge it. As I say, there's some wonderful things in that movie. I love it. But to me, it's not a proper movie because it's not a definitive vision. Like the Snyder Cut is a definitive vision of what Zack wanted to do with Justice League. It's a completed, definitive vision. He's not using Whedon's scenes at all because he shot all his own stuff. Well, Dick didn't get to shoot everything. So that's why It's not actually my worst to best Superman movies list. Anyway, Superman 2 is the first time I ever saw a superhero and supervillain battle. But it has a really, really good plot for a sequel. Superman is now established. He's comfortable in being Superman. But the problem is, he has a challenge all of a sudden, and Lois Lane finds out who he is. And his mother says to him, if you're going to be with a mortal, you have to become a mortal. And he's ready to do it, to lose his powers, to step into that chamber in the Fortress of Solitude. And there's a wonderful moment in the movie where she goes, but consider, you'll be able to be hurt like an ordinary man. You'll bleed like an ordinary man. It's such an emotional moment to me. Because as a kid going to school being bullied, I would have given anything to have Superman's powers. And to see him become human because he fell in love was a very compelling moment to me. So don't get it twisted. Superman 2, the Dickie Lester version, isn't a bad movie at all. And it's still pretty much based off the vision that Dick Donner and Tom Mankiewicz had. It is different, the Paris hostage scene. Dick Donner hated that and would never have put that in his movie, and I get that. But I really like Superman 2. It's emotional, it gives Superman a challenge, he loses his powers, you see the three villains from Krypton taking over slowly. I think it's really, really brilliant. But to see these three villains against Superman, and Superman having to use his powers against their powers, and they've all got the same powers because they're from Krypton. I think it's outstanding. I think Terrence Stamp is an outstanding villain. He's not really a Michael Shannon type of Zod. He doesn't have a deep motivation for doing what he's doing. He's a conqueror. He wants to conquer Earth. And when he first arrives, he doesn't know the son of Jor-El, Kal-El Superman, is there. But once he realizes that Superman is the son of Jor-El, he don't care about conquering anymore. He cares about getting revenge and having Superman as his slave. So there is a motivation there, but it's not as deeply fleshed out as the Michael Shannon Zod. But Terrence Stamp kind of makes you forget all that. Because not everything has to be deep, Heath Ledger type stuff, or, Michael Shannon. As great as those two, comic book movie villains are, they're probably two of my favourite comic book movie villains. They're brilliant. Well, Terrence Stamp Zod is fun. He's brilliant. He's evil. He's just evil, right? He's just nasty. It's as simple as that. And that's what I like. It's not complicated. He just happens to be a nasty bastard who wants to conquer Earth and, kick the shit out of Superman. And I'm here for it. It's a wonderful, enjoyable sequel, considering all the behind-the-scenes problems they had with Superman 2. Considering they fired Donner, it wasn't a Justice League situation. It's a very, very good film. You've got to give them credit for that. So, I think we've got 2 movies left. I hope I haven't left anything out, right? We'll recap in a moment. Anyway, there are 2 movies to go. So what is the runner-up in my worst to best Superman movie ranking? It's Man of Steel. Man of Steel is a beautiful, modern-day, contemporary take at Superman. It doesn't try and tickle you under the chin. It doesn't try to con you with nostalgia. It says, fuck this shit. We're going to do our own movie. We're going to tell our own story of a Superman arriving in the real world. He is an illegal immigrant. It would be hard for him to come to terms with his powers. I like the ways that he's a kid, and all of a sudden his X-ray vision's kicking in, his super hearing's kicking in, he's running around the school holding his ears, he locks himself in the cupboard. It's messing him up. And what I love about it as well is when it happens to Zod and when it happens to Faora. It's very, very realistic. I like the way Lois Lane has to wear a mask, a breather, when she's going up to the main scout ship, because that's what would have to happen. It's not made for human, the atmosphere is poisonous for human consumption. And Clark, Superman, starts puking blood because he's used to Earth's atmosphere and not Krypton's as well. So I love all that. The sequences on Krypton are stunning. The battles on Krypton are stunning. Russell Crowe as Jor-El is utterly compelling. Shannon and Crowe together are utterly fantastic. And you can tell that these guys were once friends. Shannon's performance, as we spoke earlier, is one of my favourite CBM supervillain turns ever. He is amazing. He's not a Terence Stamp type of villain. He's not just a nasty bastard. He really isn't a nasty bastard. This is a guy who really believes that it's his responsibility for his race to survive. And he will do anything, as he says. He will be cruel. He will hurt people. Because all that matters to him is protecting his people. That's why when he's got no people left because they've all been dragged into the Phantom Zone, he loses it. Then he actually becomes a nasty bastard. And I believe in that fight. When he says to Superman, either you die or I die, Cal. And I believe that's because he, even if he kills Superman, he knows he's still got nothing left. I think he actually wants Cal to actually kill him. But it's an amazing film. Yes, it does look stunning, but the story beats it has, as I say, are so modern and contemporary and interesting. And it may not be the Superman that I grew up with and loved, but it's still beautiful to look at, and it's a very interesting way of telling a Superman story. Unfortunately, we live in the environment today, unless you give certain nerds the film they grew up with, they'll reject it. I was watching The Phantom Menace yesterday, and it's the same with The Phantom Menace. Because nerds didn't get the Star Wars they grew up with, a lot of them rejected The Phantom Menace, and they attacked George badly for that movie. I was watching that film, as I said yesterday, and I enjoy it. I get so much from The Phantom Menace. I think it's different, but I also think it's freaking amazing. And I feel the same about Man of Steel. No, it's not Superman 78. I don't want it to be Superman 78. I didn't want Superman and Lois to be Smallville. And I'm glad that it wasn't Smallville. Got to try something new. You've got to try something new. You've got to always be, finding new ways to tell these Superman stories instead of trying to be nostalgic. Being nostalgic is lazy creativity. But Man of Steel didn't do that. It really was trying to tell an original story, and for me personally, it really worked. I love the fact that when Superman first starts flying, he's all happy and excited, but he falls down, and then he gets back up again, and he flies, and he's smiling, he's happy. He does smile in this movie, despite what you've heard. They use the word hope on multiple occasions. It really is a wonderful movie. So, we finished my Superman ranking from worst to best with my favourite Superman movie. And I'm going to tell you the reasons for that as you shout via your monitors and write down in the comments. Superman 78 is my favourite Superman movie of all time. Why is that? Well, there's many reasons for that. I think it was a lot more challenging to make a Superman movie in the 70s than it was for Zack Snyder or even James Gunn to be telling that story today. I mean, Man of Steel was released 10 years ago. But it's easier to make a Superman movie today. They've got the CGI, they've got all these techniques in VFX. Back then it was all new. I mean, the only film that perfected that level of VFX you see in Superman 78 was George Lucas in Star Wars 77. But most of the visual effects, if not all the visual effects in Superman 78 are in character. There was a few effects houses, but basically most of the stuff was shot with miniatures and, movie magic of the time. It was very challenging. It took over 2 years to make that movie. It's still one of the longest shoots on record. Making that film nearly broke poor Dick Donner because he genuinely wanted to make a great Superman movie. And to make a great Superman movie, it can't just feel great. It can't just be about something great. It has to look great. It's a Superman movie after all. We're talking about Superman, not everyday man, at the end of the day. And the movie, still today, looks brilliant. The fact that the outside of Krypton, they literally used fuel. I think they were burning a Bunsen burner and they lit this big ball thing up. And it was a miniature. And then when you go past the red sun and you see the ice and you see the structure of Krypton, it's beautiful. And some of you Man of Steel fans are going to say, yeah, but the Man of Steel, the Krypton Man of Steel is so much better. Look, first of all films must be judged or are a product of their time. Superman 78 is a product of their time. But I wouldn't say that the Krypton on Superman 78 is worse than the Krypton on Man of Steel. I think they're both stunning in their own ways. I don't think, we do live in a this or that kind of generation. Well, I'm not a this or that person. But basically, the design for Krypton was outstanding. And I think Gunn is going to use that kind of design with his Fortress of Solitude. I don't know if we're going to see Krypton in Gunn's Superman movie. But the design for Krypton is outstanding and it looks beautiful. If it wasn't for Dick Donner's Smallville sequence in the movie, there wouldn't ever be a Smallville television show. He broke ground in adapting Superman, which is one of the most challenging things to do, to make a great Superman movie. And most people have suffered and struggled to make a great Superman movie, a movie that everyone can go to a movie theatre and watch and enjoy. But Dick Donner was able to do it. I'm not saying the Dick Donner way is the only way, but for me, it has so many achievements. It creates so many techniques in visual effects. John Williams' music was absolutely iconic. And by the end of the film, when they were leaving the movie theatre, I never saw it in a movie theatre. I saw it on a television with my dad and my brother. A couple of years after it was released. I was only a small boy. But when you finish watching that movie, you have a good feeling for that character. As a kid, you want to be Superman. You're doing all this. It's fantastic. You fall in love with Lois Lane. You love Perry White. You love Jimmy Olsen. And you have a bit of a gag and a laugh with Lex Luthor and Otis and Miss Tessmacher. So it's just a great movie. It's not like, for example, Lex and Otis. It's not like we're talking about Rosenbaum's Lex Luthor from Smallville. There's not that, as I was saying with Terrence Stamp Zod, it's not like there's a deep character motivation there, but it's fun. It's funny. And he's a kind of a James Bond kind of villain, but it works. It works for me then, and it works for me today. It doesn't mean every effort has to copy what Dick Donner did. And I think everyone telling Superman stories should do something new. And that's why I really adore Man of Steel. But Superman 78 is on top of my Superman ranking from worst to best. But if you were doing a ranking from worst to best, what would be your worst Superman movie? What would be in the middle of that list? And what would be your favourite Superman movie of all time? Let me know in the comments down below. I'll see you again tomorrow.